Alright, so now we're going to look at the x-intercepts and the zeros of quadratics. So the x-intercepts is exactly that. Here is our x-axis. The x-intercepts are where our graph touches the x-axis. So that's going to be here and here. And that looks like it's going to be the ordered pair 1, 0, and it looks like the ordered pair 5, 0. So the zeros are x equals 1 and x equals 5. So they're listed. Intercepts are going to be an ordered pair. The zeros are simply that. So when we're solving these things and we're finding zeros or solutions or roots, that's exactly what we're seeing if we were having a graph of this thing. Alright, next property, use the square root property. So let's solve this thing. We're going to add 10 to both sides. When we get 2x squared is equal to 10, algebraically we're just solving this. X squared is equal to 5. To undo a square, we take the square root, and we know that square roots get us plus or minus square root of 5. So our two answers, often in the homework you might have to say square root of 5 comma negative square root of 5. You may have to list them out like that in your homework. Alright, so let's look at number 9. We're going to do the same thing. Subtract 12. 4. X squared is equal to negative 12. Then we would divide both sides by 4. X squared is equal to negative 3. Of course, undo a square, we take a square root. X is equal to plus or minus. Oh no, what happens when we have a negative sign when we have an even index? We're going to get an I. That's square root of negative 1. Recall, square root of negative 1 is equal to I. So this becomes I square root of 3. And this is our answer. In your homework, you may have to say I square root of 3, comma, negative I square root of 3. Alright, so we pick up on number 10, and we're going to divide both sides by 6. And you will have x squared is equal to 6. And then we're going to take the square root of both sides, so you will get x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 6. Once again, in your homework, you will break it apart and list them. And then one more over here, we'll do number 11. Let's divide both sides by 3. We would get x squared is equal to 11. Take the square root of both sides, and x is equal to plus or minus the square root of 11. If I listed them, positive square root of 11, negative square root of 11 for your homework. The next method we're going to talk about is going to be the complete the square method. You can see we have our quadratic here equal to 0. The first thing we're going to do is move the constant to one side by itself. So we're going to move this c over here to the right. And we want our leading coefficient to be a 1. That means this a. If it's not a 1, then we need to divide everything in the problem by the leading coefficient and make that happen. And then we're going to have a calculate our b term, divide by 2 and square it, and add this value to both sides. We'll factor the left, add like terms on the right, and then finish by solving the square root property. I know this seems kind of complex before we start it, but I'll keep that as a reminder just so if you get lost in the process, you can come back up here and kind of relocate where you need to be. Alright, so let's see this happen. Alright, the first step is move the constant to one side by itself, so I'm going to move the 6 over here because we have x squared minus 2x plus some number. We want to be able to choose this number here and complete the square method. So how do we pick what number goes here? We're going to take our box, To find that, you're going to take the b term, divide by 2, and square it. Now, what do I mean by the b term? If I was to label these, this is a known 1 here. A is 1. B is, in this case, -2. C, in this case, was -6. So when you list these, this is your A, your B, and your C. So when I say take the B term, I'm talking about -2. Okay, take the B term, divide by 2 and square it. So that's going to be -2, divide by 2 and square it. That becomes -1 squared, which is just +1. If I add a +1 over here, I must do the same thing on the other side so that it's balanced. Alright, we're on part 4 where it says factor the left side. So it's kind of like bottoms up. What multiplies to give us 1 but adds to give us -2. We could actually take this off to the side and do the bottoms up function with it to factor. Or we can use this shortcut which works for complete the square because we're working with perfect square trinomials. It'll only work for perfect square trinomials, so don't try to extend this to other just trinomials in general. So you'll take the variable of the first term, sine of the second term, square root of whatever's in this box. Square root of 1 is just 1. Put it in parentheses and square it. Over here I'm going to add like terms and get 7. Now we're back up here. Let me move this out the way. On step 5, which says solve using the square root property. Well, that's the property we just learned prior to this one. To undo a square, you take the square root. So you're going to get a square root undoes a square and vice versa. They're inverses. So you're going to get x minus 1 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 7. Now our goal is to solve for x and get x by itself. So I want to move this 1 to the other side. So that just becomes x equals 1 plus or minus the square root of 7. In your homework, 1 plus the square root of 7, comma, 1 minus the square root of 7. So you'll have to list it out like that. Alright, so let's look at 13. The first thing we want to do is we look up here, we're going to move the constant to one side by itself. So I would have x squared minus 6x, and I'm going to move -4 to the other side so it becomes a +4 when you move it. Okay, we're trying to determine what number goes in this box, and to do that we're going to come up here and calculate the b term divided by 2 and square it. We said this is going to be our b term, so it's going to be -6 divided by 2 and square it. That would be -3 squared, which is 9. If I add 9 here, I must add 9 to the other side as well. Our next step says to factor the left side. So if I look over here, I can either use bottoms up method if that's what you're most comfortable with. What multiplies to give you 9, adds to give you -6, and factor it out. Or we can use our shortcut variable of the first, sine of the second, square root of the box, square root of 9 is 3, put it in parentheses and square it, simplify the right hand side. And we're now up here on step 5, solve using the square root property. Take the square root of both sides. X minus 3 is equal to plus or minus. Don't forget your plus or minus when you take the square root. And now we're trying to get x by itself. So we're isolating the variable. And we're just going to add 3 to both sides. So we get x is equal to 3 plus or minus the square root of 13. For your homework, you will probably separate that into 2 separate terms. One time with the plus, one time with the minus. And you're done.